Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, April 10th edition of the Cluster API office hours. If you are joining live today, please go ahead and add yourself to the attending list on the agenda. And if you have any topics that you want to bring up, please go ahead and add them to the agenda as well. I see a question from somebody in the chat. If you're asking about the adding your name in the attending list, then go ahead and yes, please do that. All right. To start off, we have Andrew has a PR for Kubernetes Autoscaler for Cluster API.
If you're not talking, could you please mute yourself?
So the PR that I submitted is into the Autoscaler repo and is a cut of the OpenShift cloud provider that we did with some changes to accommodate what is currently master upstream in the Autoscaler. So I haven't seen any feedback on that yet, and I was hoping to attend the SIG meeting this week, but I couldn't make it. So I was going to go talk to them again on Monday next week to see if we can get any traction with the PR.
That sounds good. Anybody have any questions on that? All right, moving on. We have Tim with a group topic about scope and purpose.
So I wanted to just frame the discussion because we had this at the broader SIG level too as well with regards to, there's a lot of conversation back and forth with the requirements doc that a lot of folks were working on earlier. And one thing I want people to realize is that it's not a end-all be-all, and it's not the, it's a work in progress. The whole purpose of that document is essentially for us to frame the next conversations to come for V1 Alpha 2. So that way it allows us to have meaningful conversations to say like the boundary lines stop at some point for what is Cluster API. I think with that context, Vince has put up a PR for folks to take a review. I was thinking maybe like a 1-week timeout for feedback and then just kind of merge it because it's meant to serve as guardrails for conversation pieces that are going to be the KEPs or the follow-on work items that are coming for the modifications. So if you have questions, comments, complaints, concerns, please voice them. But also realize and recognize that it's a living document and it's meant to be refined over time.
On that note, Vince, I know there were a couple of comments on the PR. Did you want to bring that up real quick?
I didn't have anything to bring up at this point. I'm just waiting a little bit to just get more comments and just update the PR as we go. So I think we can discuss a thing on the PR itself.
All right, sounds good. Any questions, comments, concerns there?
Just a comment is that I think that at some point in the document, all along the discussion we have, we kind of mix the API and the reference implementation with always like Cluster API, and probably in our mind that is clear, or in the mind that people has been working longer on this, but as an external first-time contact, probably it's not necessarily obvious what the difference is. It's just probably something that we should keep in mind. Because actually the objective said that we offer like a specification, an API and a reference implementation for common parts. And also we have like external components. And we always talk like API in the document. Every few moments we make a difference, but probably I suggest that probably we should make a second read, just keep in mind what we're talking about. If necessary, make a specific point that this is the specification of the implementation.
So I definitely think that's completely valid. One of the other things too is one of the goals of that document was to stay relatively high level and not try to get into implementation details as much. And I think as we continue to build out the designs, that's a place where we can definitely draw that clear distinction between what is part of the project itself, what's reference implementation, and what's on the individual implementers to provide as well. Anybody else have any questions, comments, or concerns? All right, back to Tim again for a PSA.
I have two PSAs. One is that there is a new contributor meeting this Friday for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. So if you're new to the SIG, welcome to attend. Feel free to ask any questions, how to get you lined up, give you some background information of how the SIG was formed, how some of the sub-projects exist, and sort of what falls underneath their umbrellas. The goal is to sort of give you new contributors an understanding of how they can plug in, what is in scope and out of scope for certain projects, and then get folks ramped up so that they can actively contribute to the different sub-projects that are part of the SIG. The second PSA I had was there's also going to be a meeting at KubeCon Europe. So during the Contributor Summit, there will be a separate session for folks who want to get together. I am actively soliciting feedback on that session. But remember that the SIG is very broad in scope. So we want to have discussions that kind of apply to several of the sub-projects underneath the umbrella. And we might, spin off subsections for Cluster API too as well.
On that note, I also have a PSA to share. I was able to reach out to the CNCF, and they're working on a couple of designs for t-shirts for Cluster API. And I've also been able to talk with some of the folks inside of VMware, and we're going to be able to actually give out t-shirts to contributors of the project. Unfortunately, I don't yet have the ability to share the designs yet, because I'm not going to have those until later this week. But I also have a deadline to have the order in for the t-shirts by Friday. So if you are interested, please go ahead and add your name to the doc that I linked in there, and some information. And if you are not able to attend KubeCon in Barcelona, please reach out to me privately with an address so that we can go ahead and get the shirts shipped out to you. And I will send an email out to the mailing list once we have the design, so you can take a look at those as well.
Are those like professional and cool designs, or something like the designs that the KubeCon t-shirts had?
I don't fully know yet. I've sent a couple of high-level kind of themes that I'm looking for, and I'm going to get the first cut of the designs back from the artist at the CNCF either today or tomorrow, hopefully.
Cool, thanks.
Then another one for me, I went ahead and I sent a PR, and the PR is linked in the notes here, to update the repository owners and security contacts. I noticed in particular that the security contacts were woefully outdated, referencing old SIG leadership. And while I was in there, I went ahead and kind of added myself to the list, because I've already had kind of extended ACLs into the GitHub repo anyway. So this would kind of formalize that. So please take a look, provide comments, and we'll probably set a timeout date at some point for it. Any preferences on a timeout for lazy consensus?
We usually have 1 week.
Sounds good to me. Moving on, Andy for communication methods.
Thanks, Jason. So I was wondering, and this is for everybody, how can we make sure that the community can be as involved as they want to as we're working on the changes that are coming up for Cluster API? And wanted to recognize that not everybody can make Zoom meetings that are friendly for their time zone, especially when we're spread across the entire world. So thoughts that I had potentially could be creating a Cluster API focused Google group or other project focused forum or mailing list, trying to be cognizant that certain countries may not have access to Google groups, for example, but more specifically, just trying to wonder, like, should we move to more asynchronous communication methods? And if we do, should we have it split out from the SIG cluster lifecycle Google group, given that not everybody who's in the SIG might be interested in cluster API?
Technically, there's not precedent for that. And there's also, you'd have to work with Contribex. So the problem here is to do that, you need to talk with other people. And
Sure.
it becomes more bureaucratic. So we'd have to talk with Contribex, and then we'd have to talk with the people who run the community stuff and update docs to make all this go.
Yeah, Tim, so one of my major concerns is if we start using the general SIG cluster lifecycle mailing list for more heavy asynchronous communication, especially as we start hashing out the design proposals, that it may end up being a lot of noise for folks that aren't involved in cluster API.
There, you could use Discuss, which is more broadly applicable and would have a better searchable history. Google Groups, like we mentioned earlier, is not accessible by folks in China, but you can create a forum on Discuss, and that might be a better venue by which folks could communicate, and that has precedent as well, and wouldn't have all of the issues that exist around trying to create new communication lines.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't particularly saying it needed to be a separate Google group or something. So if everybody's cool with using Discuss, then I think we should do that.
I think Discuss is great. And have a mobile phone app as well.
So, sorry to be dense, but why not GitHub?
So not everything is necessarily a GitHub issue, right?
I think it's just we need to I understand your point is that we need basically the specific discussion venue that's searchable and has proper history and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's something that is thread-centric, I suppose, not something that is like an issue-centric. And threading in GitHub is kind of complicated. You have to really do that manually if you want to do some threading there. You kind of have to code people manually and all that stuff.
Yeah, and accessible, probably preferably from around the globe.
Okay. Yeah, there's a trade-off between you know, having one place where all the discussion is, as opposed to having a bunch of different places. Because I feel like we still end up having I guess some discussion in GitHub. You know, we have all these Google Docs, so
Yeah, actually, that's going to be problematic because we will have the GitHub, where it's more or less clear what you will find there, but then we will have the Discuss, we will have we will keep the mailing list probably, and then Slack. And I'm afraid that conversation will fragment over different platforms, mostly between the group, the mailing list, the Slack, and the Discuss. I don't know.
So I think one thing we need to be careful with is to try to avoid using relying too much on synchronous method of communication, especially as we try to build consensus around a lot of this stuff. So while Slack is great for kind of that synchronous communication, it's not so great about kind of recording, you know, why decisions were made and when they were made and things like that. Mailing lists generally fill that void, but I do worry that we are excluding some folks in the APAC region in particular by doing that, and we have been seeing some increased contributions there as well. And actually, I wasn't even aware that they didn't have access to the Google group until today, and that actually explains why we didn't actually get any feedback from anybody in that region when we were trying to seek out times for the goals and requirements.
Introbex purposely set up Discuss to solve this problem.
I think Discuss is great. Yeah, I think we should try that and see how it goes. GitHub is definitely a terrible place to have threads, and yeah, I mean, we already have discussions that are like non-searchable, non-indexed, as in the actual videos that you'll have to watch to find out what was actually said, and it's not indexed by the meeting notes or anything like that. So. And GitHub is terrible for search too.
Okay, so I think the message is for anybody who thinks, like me, to use GitHub for any kind of discussion, just stop doing it.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think if you're making broader decisions, you know, I think there's a fine line between what should go in an email thread versus what goes in GitHub. I think as we're broaching a lot of new KEPs, those high-level design decisions and discussions, having those in a Discuss thread is useful not only for understanding but for posterity. But once we've settled on a design, you know, and you're breaking down the work items for execution and even arbitrating issues there, it makes perfect sense to use GitHub, right?
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, the Discuss wouldn't be to kind of preserve the end result. At the end of the day, the end result will be committed to the repository as the design. But as we try to work through some of the issues, especially where there's potentially contention between different points of view, having a venue to where we can actually discuss that is what we're looking for right now.
Yeah, I think we're proposing it as like an alternative to the mailing list, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed from Discuss is that like there is like a really few categories. So there's just like a general discussion. Tim, do you know where will be filed? Like there's discussion like for the SIG or cluster API?
Let's talk with George. We can do this asynchronously and talk with George and ask him how to organize it in the best way for people to search and to find things.
Perfect. I'll follow up with him.
Would the Kubernetes official forum be a possibility for this?
Discuss is the official forum, isn't it?
Oh, I'm thinking of Discuss with a Q. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I think they removed the Q, but yeah, I mean there's just that one thing that's discussed, and maybe it has a Q, maybe it doesn't have a Q.
Okay.
So the last thing I had in this section that I added was about Google Docs specifically, because I know not everybody can access them. So if we're working on KEPs for cluster API features, is there something else that works that will work for everyone, or is Google Docs still kind of the best thing even though it excludes some people?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Considering that what we just said.
I mean, I don't think that Discuss is likely to be an appropriate avenue or venue for collaborating on a KEP. I mean, that needs to be something like Google Docs or HackMD or any sort of collaborative editing platform, or a pull request to GitHub, which admittedly is harder to work with over time as you get more and more comments, but presumably it's accessible by more than, say, Google Docs.
The standard operating procedure for every other project that exists is to create a Google Doc, and if people from China want to access, there's always ways around that portion, and there's always once you've finalized the collaboration point, then the PR has to occur to some repository, and that PR is another venue by which they can often communicate.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Discuss plus Google Docs plus the PR is probably good enough for collaboration.
And that's minus the Discuss. That's what everyone else typically does across the whole project. So I do like the venue for Discuss for recording posterity and have searchable history, honestly. I wish the rest of the project is on this.
Just for clarification, this is going to replace the mailing list?
Not necessarily replace the mailing list, but it would be the place that we would take kind of more in-depth asynchronous discussion around the design proposals.
Like that's how we do our tickets, right?
Possibly we could still use the mailing list to share the information about the discussion happening in Discuss.
Yes.
More like announcements in the mailing list for the broader community, so to speak, but not for more intensive interaction, because it's horrible when you try to do that. It's really bad.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So is that the proposal? Announcements go to mailing list, more intense discussion to Discuss, decisions recorded in GitHub.
Yeah, we should probably, Vince mentioned he wanted to sync with George. I don't, if you wanted to take point, or Andy wanted to take point, if somebody wants to take point and then write up a summary and then send it out to the list of the details and follow up with George, I think that seems appropriate. So someone should take an action item to do all the follow-up and logistics.
Yeah, I'll take it, and after that, also update the README in the repo, so it's clear where each communication channel what it should do.
It seems a little bit weird to have a second communication channel, one for announcements, one for discussion, if the point is to include people from all regions, where one of those two things is not available in all regions.
Oh, it's just that people are used to hearing announcements on the mailing list and such things. People who are already on the mailing list, so that they know that there's a discussion elsewhere.
So it sounds like we might want to actually mirror the announcements between Discuss and the mailing list then.
Oh yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds better.
There's nothing else on that topic. Next item is Vince with breaking down the work streams, and CAPS with the CA instead of a K.
We have a new term called CAPS, Cluster API Enhancements Proposal. This is hopefully what the result of what the workstream should have, one or more probably. At the top of the meeting notes, which I'll link again in the chat, we added 4 work streams for now, but we should discuss if we need more. We have the name of the work stream, the facilitators, and the meeting minutes, which probably link to a Google Doc with meeting notes. And each facilitator should actually send out probably a doodle at some point to align on some meeting times in Zoom or like a Discuss as we mentioned. Please add yourself as participants, or if you want to be a facilitator, add your name to the list. The facilitator role is mostly to organize like as I mentioned, like the Google Doc, or just like pretty much the logistics. It's like shouldn't be seen as like kind of like a lead or anything, but it's more like a representation of the group. And as with that, like I can share my screen and we can go over if we want to, but let's see here. Can anybody see this? So what we're proposing here is like 4 work streams. We have extension mechanism, which we have discussed a lot. We have the data model, which will include the new data types and the refactoring that we previously discussed, but with the new requirements in mind. Then we have control plane lifecycle management and the node bootstrap logic. These are the 4 work streams that we see kind of like going forward. They might have, some of them like might be at some point like closed or like absorbed by others. But as right now, like I also feel like it's like a good starting point to align the community. Does anyone have any questions, comments?
So like right now, for those who are new to this, like there should be an overview, like at least an understanding of like a high level overview of what the different work streams are, because the context of extension mechanism is so broad. I know what you mean because I've been around this project from the beginning, but I don't think people who are new to this understand what that actually means.
Yes. We can go one by one and discuss them. I was hoping to actually do that asynchronously though, but Jason, you want to give like a brief description?
Yeah, sure. So for the extension mechanism, what we were looking at is we want to try to isolate the discussion around how do we extend cluster API as far as interacting with provider implementations. And this would cover both kind of like bootstrapping providers and infrastructure providers, wherever we need to kind of provide like a plug-in model. That's what we want to cover with the extension mechanism work stream. So far, we've had high-level discussions around that potentially being webhooks, that potentially being gRPC, or being independently reconciled CRDs. So that's kind of the high-level gist of that. We want to try to kind of compare and contrast the different approaches, find out which model that we want to choose, if there's even a single model that we want to choose for all of the different extension points, and how we want to proceed there. Did you want to cover the data model?
Yeah,
Vince?
so for the data model, this is going to be kind of like a little bit more broad. Hopefully this work stream actually will split in multiple other work stream. For example, we talked about machines and the scope of the machines and what they should do. This is like how do we refine data model that we have right now. Right now we have cluster and machine as high-level objects. They live under cluster.kubernetes.io API group. So this work stream should cover all things related of the organization for high-level concepts, but also the responsibilities for new types or the existing types. Hopefully I covered most of it.
And just to be clear, in some cases, some of these work streams are going to have overlapping items. And wherever those overlapping items are, we want to, as much as we can, kind of black box those things and focus on the areas where there's distinct ownership for that particular work stream. And then as we get further along in the process, we'll need to reconcile kind of that black boxing between the overlapping concerns.
Yes, and like I want to add like the PR around the high level requirements is meant to be like as a starting point, right? Like as Tim mentioned, it's a living document which like we can like, for example, like just like start right now and then update it in the future, but has to like kind of it will start the conversation for all the work stream and kind of give a base for what's in scope and what's out of scope. The next two are control plane lifecycle management and the node bootstrap logic. I'll give you the honor for that.
All right, so for the control plane lifecycle management, as we started discussing in like the requirements document, we wanted to be able to have an actual story around being able to manage the control plane as first class kind of thing. We wanted to be able to scale those and then obviously scale down if we're deleting. And then we also need to have kind of an upgrade story around how do we move from one version to the next for the control plane. So again, just kind of some overlapping concerns with the data model and extension mechanism here, but to the ability that we can kind of black box those things and focus more on the discussion on kind of the requirements that are needed and how do we start solving those things. For this one in particular, we don't yet have a facilitator here, and the goal that we have for the facilitator is not necessarily to be the owner for these topics, but to rather kind of coordinate like meeting times if there are any kind of Zoom meetings for the group, facilitate the discussions and that sort of thing. So anybody interested in facilitating the control plane lifecycle management, please do speak up. We'll also send out an email after this meeting to try to solicit folks for facilitating the ones that don't have facilitators yet as well. All right. Andy, did you want to go into node bootstrapping?
Sure. So this is covering things such as what are the extension points around providing the way to bootstrap a Kubernetes node, whether that's for the control plane or non-control plane. We envision having a reference default implementation that is kube-adm based. And speaking about some implementation details, we probably would want to support both pre-boot, like cloud init type of things, as well as post-boot configurations. That may be part of the node bootstrapping logic workstream, or it may just be part of the data model, or they may intertwine. But this is really about, given a server resource and a desired Kubernetes version, how do we consistently get it configured and bootstrapped regardless of what infrastructure you're running on?
And the other thing to note is that these work streams should basically be considered starting points. If you have thoughts on any topic that is not already covered that should be an independent work stream, please do speak up and let's get those kicked off as well.
The last question that I have is, does anybody want to add any new work stream? Please do at the end, or speak up now if we want to discuss it.
How about node lifecycle management?
Yeah, that just crossed my mind as far as maybe something like that could look at how we interact with cluster autoscaler. That might fall under the node lifecycle.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking. Like the whole question of which node gets deleted and how do machine sets actually scale, stuff like that.
Do you think that's completely distinct from the node bootstrapping logic, or should those kind of be merged together to node lifecycle management?
Right.
Should we just call it node things?
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably better to keep those related.
Thank you for bringing that up, though, Andrew.
I'm not sure
Maybe
they
it
are
should be
so
node
related.
lifecycle, because bootstrapping is just part of a life cycle. That makes
Maybe we can just rename this to lifecycle management.
Yeah.
Yep.
Team, you signed up for something more scoped, and now we enlarged it.
Thanks.
So one question I guess for me is this is node lifecycle management. So here we're talking about specifically Kubernetes nodes. And this is where I wasn't clear on the scope document, or it wasn't clear to me out of that is, obviously that implies being able to create some sort of underlying server, some sort of underlying machine, not to use the same word. And that's, then making that into a Kubernetes node is sort of a second step there. Is that type of thing, which is an enormous category, at all within scope here? Do we want to just define an API we need out of the provider to get a machine? I guess I'm not clear on that boundary in scope.
I think the work streams are meant to define the boundaries, right? We can, the work streams, like if we talk about node lifecycle management, we can say, we can determine what we want to work on as a group. We just need to have buckets, I think, for now. And then as we iterate, we'll determine what is in scope and out of scope. Like I'm very interested, particularly in image stamping, and we talked about that before. That's like part of the bootstrapping process, right? Or it could be leveraged by multiple things. So I think we could determine from the groups if we need more groups, or to break down what they're going to be responsible for.
Yeah, I mean, I even think like some of these things, I don't know if they belong in SIG cluster lifecycle or SIG cloud provider, right? I mean, where's the boundary between those two?
That's explicitly clear. Like cloud provider integrations are extension points directly into the cloud provider. So that's been clear since epoch of where cluster lifecycle begins and where cloud provider ends. So those are well-established API endpoints for cloud provider integration.
But so creation of but we have machine controller, which is creating VMs. So are we relying upon the cloud provider functionality to do that? Or are we implementing things in our providers to do that?
It depends. That's relative to the provider implementation, right? So like we can get into philosophical debates here, but I don't think that's the intention.
Well, no, yeah, I'm just trying to understand more about it.
Well, so the Kubernetes cloud provider interfaces don't have anything for machines.
Yeah.
So
exactly,
I think it's pretty clear, like as Tim was saying, the answer is no. Like the Kubernetes cloud providers don't do anything with machines, and that's where we can.
I understand that, but yeah, again, I think we just, as long as it's clear to everybody, I guess it's fine, right? If there's cloud, do we centralize organizationally? Do we centralize all the cloud provider specific functionality in SIG cloud provider, or do we take some of it here? And that's a bigger question maybe than we want to answer. Or maybe it's already just clear and I'm just coming in late and so it's not clear to me.
This is a great conversation topic for Friday. We welcome you to the contribute, and we can hem and haw on the details there. But I think that's kind of orthogonal to this particular discussion of work streams.
I have another question, or maybe we're going to get there now on the template. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that some of those discussions around, does this belong as part of cluster API? Does this belong somewhere else? Do we collaborate with a different group? Do we try to factor out logic into a common place? I think these are some of the discussions we have to have as part of these work streams. It's also going to come up, for example, with the cluster autoscaler as well. With the cluster autoscaler hosting logic to determine which node to scale down, that introduces a potential for completely different behavior, whether you're auto-scaling a machine deployment or if you're manually scaling the machine deployment, and how can we kind of align that behavior to be kind of more consistent. Those are some of the discussions that are going to spin out of this, and I think we'll be able to more clearly define those boundaries as part of the work streams as well.
I just want to say that this is really great. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad we did this. The work streams, yeah, it's amazing. I think this makes a lot of sense, like because we had all these discussions where things were also sort of different things were happening, were discussed in one place at the same time, and yeah, really welcome this.
Quick question on a potential additional work stream for infrastructure. So infrastructure, including network security groups, things like this. That I'm not seeing that covered. I know it is specific to providers, but there is at least I have a particular case in mind that's sort of across all providers. So for example, I bring up a cluster with the cluster API, and then I create some services of the load balancer type, right? And underneath the cloud controller manager goes out and creates a bunch of resources for me. Then I go to the cluster API and I tear down that cluster, but the cluster API doesn't manage the load balancers that back those services, and there's not necessarily a mechanism that's going to ensure that those get torn down. And as the cluster API is bringing down this infrastructure, all of a sudden it can hit, for instance, in AWS, a dependency violation because, hey, I can't bring down this network or this VPC that I created, I being the cluster API controller, because there's this load balancer here that I don't manage, I'm not aware of.
Yeah. So I specifically kind of try to leave the infrastructure out because I think it goes into data model. I mean, truthfully, extension mechanism data model kind of will touch probably like across the different work streams. It's kind of like you can imagine like some foundation, right? Like that's what other like work stream will like kind of build upon. But they are scoped to be like running in parallel, like so that like for example, as you said, like infrastructure, we can define what the infrastructure is and what we want to do for cluster API within the data model, and if necessary, we can spin off into another work stream with folks that are interested in driving that.
One of my broader concerns here is that we don't become too fragmented because these things will percolate back and forth across each other. I think it's an imperative that if decisions are made or updates are given back to this larger group as part of the weekly sync, so that way, it's kind of like it's part of the whole body. If you move your leg, vigorously, your other parts of your body are going to shake. So you need to be able to have awareness of things that are going on. So I think part of the responsibility of the facilitator is to do a readout potentially to the broader group. Yeah,
that brings up the other thing that I added down here. Oh, I see. And Nadir's adding that. So this was going to be a template for workstream updates. So for example, like next week meeting, the facilitators can give like an update for extension mechanism, data model, and all the different work streams, and we can keep going so that we can kind of like keep the community in sync with each other. One other thing is we were thinking about using GitHub projects, so the facilitators or other members of the cluster API project could use project in GitHub to kind of like assign issues or PRs to their own project so that we can keep it scoped. And we talked about the facilitator role. I don't know if we have to talk about participation rules at this point, but we can probably sync on those later. Andy, did you have anything for participation rules?
Yeah, just some of the things that I've noticed across many Zoom meetings over the past couple of years is that sometimes it's hard for people to get their opinions voiced. So we could try to use Zoom's raise hand feature or other methodologies as well. I think I wanted to call out that the facilitator or facilitators should work with each work stream the members of each work stream to figure out the best way to be as inclusive as possible.
Sounds good. I think with that, I can give you just back. I think I'm done. If you have any concerns, you can reach out in Slack or personally in DM and give any feedback.
I had a question on the template. Why are we having our own template and not using the KEP? What is the difference between the two? And what's the goal there?
Well, I guess Tim can give out the logistics, but the idea is to keep in the same repo, because this is a sub project of the SIG cluster lifecycle, the goals and non-goals as the main starting point, as we mentioned, and keep all the proposal inside our own repo. The KEP, the cluster API enhancement proposal, is shaped after the KEP upstream, with some parts removed, which like might not make sense for our sub project. But the idea is to keep it like so that the sub project can kind of like run on its own until, like, for example, we reach like GA or like beta. Tim, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that pretty much. Well, I'll add a small little bit. I think the purpose of this too is to understand the boundary lines and make it explicit between where upstream KEPs begin and end and what their intention were. Upstream KEPs were meant to communicate broad states of features for KK, right? And they cut across KK. Sub-projects have their own governance model, and that's even specified inside of the community repository. And because it has its own release time frame and it's not dependent upon the rest of KK, we want to have a standard way for us to communicate design proposals, but we also don't want to go through bureaucracy.
Sure. Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
Just it allows us to iterate faster in the smaller group, and these things aren't cross-cutting necessarily.
Exactly. Yeah. We still want to have a similar format, you know, but not all of the other fields make sense. Not all their details make sense. And at some point at the end of the day, we want to be able to cut a release. So it's okay. I know sometimes if you put a KEP up, it's death by 1,000 needles sometimes in the community repository. And it's a much smaller group. So let's keep it focused and fair and honest and just keep it moving.
Tim, there's a question in chat about new contributor onboarding that I think you might be able to answer.
What does it say here? Can workstreams be part of a new contributor onboarding SCL? We can talk about it for sure. Yes. Was workstream easier to join for? I think this is all kind of new. This is a little bit, because we have such a broad swath of things we want to accomplish and such a large group of people, breaking down the structure makes it a little more sense because not everybody's interested in all the things. And also, in such a large meeting such as this one, we have a tendency to bike shit on some topics. So keeping individual scoped down work streams makes a ton of sense. So this is a little bit new. You can feel free to ask questions, but I don't know if I'm going to have a definitive answer for that question.
A question I have, is the intention that each work stream has its own separate meeting? Or we will rely more on discuss for this work stream and keep this meeting for the whole initiative, and to be sure that everyone is aligned across the work streams?
I would think both. What I was thinking is that each facilitator would kind of like set up a meeting that could be weekly, bi-weekly, depending on like what the community wants to do. And a Google Doc to take agenda notes like we do for this meeting, right? And then like that should be as long as it's necessary. Like we don't want to like drag it like forever, like if it's not needed, right? But we should still keep kind of giving updates to this broader group so that we can definitely be in sync. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes, because my problem is that being in Europe, I mean, the tendency will be that, I mean, for me now it's almost 8 p.m. and this is an early meeting, and we have some meetings at 9 p.m. or stuff like that. So be careful. If we have many more meetings, I can accommodate 2-3 meetings a week outside office hours. But if we add 3 more meetings for the different work streams, the problem is not to overlap them because many people is interested in more than one. And the second one is for us in Europe, it's going to be harder and harder to keep up with this meeting because, only I achieve my work schedule for late night. But that's what I would prefer, not to proliferate in meetings as a
that's a fair concern.
mechanism, as a default mechanism. To say, like, okay, if we have to meet, let's meet, but not like let's have a weekly meeting or bi-weekly just because of making that an appointment, because that's going to be hard for us to keep up.
Yeah, I would expect for us to have like a little more meetings to start, and then start the conversation, and then move to asynchronous, because I feel like that also worked pretty fine for example, for the requirements and in the goals and non-goals, where like we kind of met once or twice, I believe, and then we moved to like Google Doc, for example. So we can move to that and discuss to kind of solicit feedback and comments.
And I can speak to what I was thinking about doing for the extension mechanism, which was basically try to solicit times that would work for an initial kickoff meeting. And then from there, we can determine, how to proceed from there, whether it's fully asynchronous or have a meeting to, resync period from time to time as well. But I think the initial kickoff meeting would probably be good for all of these to start shaping the discussion. And then from there, let's go as asynchronously as possible.
So for action item for facilitators, we have the schedule or like draw a doodle or something. Send out a doodle in Slack or mailing list. Then schedule kickoff meeting. I'm adding this to the notes. And anything else?
If we're going to do this in a way that encourages asynchronous participation, then, and especially the APAC folks, then the mailing list is probably not the best place. And I don't know about their participation on Slack. So maybe getting that discuss stuff set up first and then publicize the doodles that way would achieve, better participation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead. If you're first, sorry, my apologies.
Oh no, I was just saying, like, I think even if we set up discuss, there will be some like ramp up time to like kind of make the community familiarize with this new mechanism, because we'd never done this in a SIG or sub project before. So we need to like try to reach out as much as possible.
Yeah, so I think we can send to the mailing list. We can figure out the discuss aspect and post on discuss. We can also use other social media mechanisms like Twitter or whatever, and just try and broadcast it as much as we can, and get people in our social networks to broadcast it. And if there's people that we feel are potentially getting missing out, and you have direct communications to them, like feel free to email them or reach out to them in whatever way. So basically just broadcast this all over the place once we start getting the doodles set up.
I have a bit of a newbie question here. I'm interested to join one of the streams, but I need to know what it implies, what it involves, what it is, what it's all about, so that I make a proper and informed decision and being of most help rather than.
Sure. So with each work stream, the goal is to produce one or multiple KEPs or capes, depending on how we end up pronouncing it, that go into the cluster API repository. And each work stream needs to define what's in and out of scope for it. Probably look at the use cases that everybody's been putting together and see which use cases apply to each work stream. But ultimately, we want to have these KEPs/capes that have enough design details that people could go and implement them. So we talked about what each of the work streams is at the beginning of the discussion on work streams. If you have further questions on what their scope is, please reach out either here, Slack, mailing list, whatever. But what I would hope is that we can have these kickoff meetings and then move fairly quickly into asynchronous self-organizing groups where we are actively working on Google Docs or whatever the mechanism is for producing these KEPs, so that we can start actually putting together PRs for V1 Alpha 2.
I would hope that these work streams would eventually be ephemeral, right? Just like
Yes.
working groups inside of Kubernetes. So that way we fold back into the main meeting and then we federate out the work.
+1 to that.
Anybody have any other topics for today?
I'll try to cover it in less than a minute. So around the user stories, we have the document on user stories. I was gonna to open a new pull request to add these user stories into one like markdown document in the cluster API repo. The idea is to kind of keep this as a tracking document, so like kind of a reference where each work stream, when we create a new KEP, for example, we get like, for example, the user stories that like match the KEP and take them out, so that like kind of we can bring the reference to 0 at some point. Does that make sense? Perfect. Back to you, Jason.
All right. Anybody else have anything else before we wrap up? All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Bye.